Thank you so much. When I climbed off a plane at 7 in the morning yesterday and walked into a conference to work there all day, I told some people what I'll tell you now, which is that if you fall asleep while I'm speaking, or if I fall asleep while I am speaking, it is not your fault. So my topic is special divine action, the state of the art, and the uses of history. And part of my task this afternoon is to narrate, to the best of my abilities, a story, to sketch how the recent history of the discussion of special divine action, at least among philosophers, has come to its present point, to the present state of the art. But of course, the present is a moving target, and so the story is incomplete. And the other half of my task is to go back into the history of the subject, to look for some forgotten chapters that might give us some clues as to how the story might move on from here. In the middle of the 20th century, most philosophical discussions of the topic began with Hume's famous critique in his essay of Miracles. And as a quick trawl through the philosophy of religion anthologies will confirm, most discussions ended there as well, as with maybe a bit of haggling over the exact details of Hume's argument or an attempt to reformulate it for modern ears. Although I was a philosophy student with a more than average interest in this subject, I cannot recall ever once being told by any of my professors that there was anything else of interest or importance to read on this topic. We were all, no doubt, dimly aware that some folks like Augustine and Aquinas had thought about divine action in some ways, but that was, in our post-Humean era, of absolutely no concern. We had discovered the silver bullet. We had discovered the everlasting check on all sorts of superstitious delusion. Why should we clamber back through dusty volumes in search for Thomas Aquinas or more obscure authors for that matter? How we moved from this philosophical steady state half a century ago into the more dynamic and expanding field of inquiry that we enjoy today is as interesting a question as how we got stuck in it in the first place. At least two factors, I think, are responsible for rousing philosophy from its dogmatic slumber. The first is the modern refinement of probabilistic tools of analysis. The second is the rediscovery of the fact that this subject does, in fact, have a history. The former brings us up to the present. The latter takes us back in time, but may, if I am not mistaken, help us to map the future as well. Hume's argument against miracles must be, because of his empiricism, a non-deductive argument. Beginning in the late 1960s, Bayesian methods of probabilistic analysis found their way into the philosophical mainstream, first in the philosophy of science and shortly thereafter in the philosophy of religion as well. Soon enough, Hume's admirers began to apply those methods to his famous argument, assuming at first that if only a few details about the proper formulation or representation of Hume's claim could be tidied up, this procedure would yield a satisfying and rigorous formulation of his objection to reported miracles. It did not. And as attempt after attempt ended in failure, a horrible suspicion arose that the reason for the failures lay not in a lack of technical ingenuity on the part of Hume's advocates, but in the objection itself. By the late 1990s, the suspicion was confirmed by several different authors. Hume's objection, probabilistically formulated, does not work. The everlasting check began to look like nothing more than a long-standing urban legend. The reactions of the Humean faithful have been remarkably varied. Some have urged that Hume's argument cannot be reconstructed along Bayesian lines because, strange to relate, there is no consensus on what Hume's argument is or what he is trying to establish with it. Others have decided that despite what almost everyone has understood since the first publication of the essay, Hume never was trying to establish an absolute barrier to rational belief in miracles, but was just setting the bar rather high, and anyone who thinks otherwise was a gross misreader of Hume. Yet others have proposed that we can capture Hume's intention best by abandoning ordinary mathematical frameworks and adopting non-standard analysis or non-Pascalian probability. Such disarray among forces that within living memory held essentially unchallenged sway over the field is astonishing. The very fact that someone has in the 21st century felt it necessary to publish a book with the title A Defense of Hume on Miracles is a testimony to the magnitude of the revolution. 50 years ago, the publication of such a book with such a title would have been almost as unthinkable as the publication by an agnostic of a book on the subject of miracles with the title Hume's Abject Failure. The recognition of the breakdown of Hume's argument under a probabilistic reconstruction has paved the way for several other developments, both critical and constructive. On the critical side, certain other limitative claims regarding probabilistic arguments for reported miracles have been shown wanting. Two of these merit particular consideration or mention here. First, in the opening chapter of his book, The Miracle of Theism, J.L. Mackey claims that a reported miracle cannot have evidential force for anyone who does not already believe in the existence of God. His assertion is sufficiently bold to be worth quoting. It is pretty well impossible that reported miracles should provide a worthwhile argument for theism addressed to those who are initially inclined to atheism or even to agnosticism. Such reports, this is all Mackey, such reports can form no significant part of what, following Aquinas, we might call a summa contra gentiles, or what, following Descartes, we could describe as being addressed to infidels. Not only are such reports unable to carry any rational conviction on their own, but also they are unable even to contribute independently to the kind of accumulation or battery of arguments referred to in the introduction. To this extent, Hume is right. Mackey's claim did not go unchallenged. It was contested on informal grounds several times in the philosophical literature, but as Richard Otis showed in the 1996, within a Bayesian framework which Mackey himself elsewhere adopts, the claim collapses at once. For it is tantamount to saying that where H is the hypothesis of a miracle and E is testimony to the miracle, probability of H given E can be greater than probability of H only when the probability of H is high enough, where it exceeds some value K, say 0.5. This stipulation directly violates Bayes' theorem. The second technical failure arises from a different and perhaps unexpected quarter. In the third volume of his Warrant trilogy, Alvin Plantinga mounts a criticism of the historical case for Christianity, claiming that Swinburne's argument is vulnerable to something that Plantinga calls the principle of dwindling probabilities. This principle turns out to be closely related to an innocuous bit of mathematics known as the chain rule. Initially, I planned to have a PowerPoint presentation and to throw that up on the screen to dazzle you, but we'll have to do without that. The simple version of the chain rule is simply that when you've got a number of claims, each of which has only a modest probability, the probability of the conjunction of them tends to come out quite low because it typically involves a multiplication of numbers, each of which is somewhat rather smaller than 1, and as you multiply these together, you get small numbers very quickly. How someone technically sophisticated enough to understand the chain rule in probability could have thought that he could give a proper representation of Swinburne's argument without making use of Bayes' theorem remains to this day an unsolved mystery. But the critique based on the principle of dwindling probabilities unquestionably collapses for several reasons. The first, if the background information is rich enough, as Swinburne and many others would argue it is, to give a high probability not merely to bare theism, but also to specific versions of theism, then numbers such as Plantinga supplies for the relevant conditional probabilities for are misleadingly low. Second, and more importantly, the prior probability for bare theism does not place an upper bound on the probability for theism together with more specific doctrines, given additional specific relevant information. There is simply no general rule governing, say, the transition between the probability that God exists and the probability that God exists and, Moses parted the waters of the sea, given much more specific information. say, testimony to the latter event. Everything here depends on the details. There is no legitimate way to escape from the thicket of special questions. There is no silver bullet. On the constructive side, a number of recent developments deserve special notice. First, there is renewed interest in the project of ramified natural theology, the extension of the project of natural theology into the specific claims of particular religious traditions. In a striking illustration of this trend, Richard Swinburne, having meticulously mapped the contours of the traditional arguments for the existence of God, has moved forward to a discussion of the New Testament as a body of evidence, considered against the broader background already covered in his works for the resurrection of God incarnate. Second, the question of modern-day miracles, including medical events documented in Western hospitals, has recently been opened in earnest. The very suggestion is staggering. A healthy dose of initial skepticism seems quite warranted, but if we have learned any lesson from the collapse of Hume's everlasting check, it should be that we have no right to put such claims beyond the reach of evidence. Third, there are signs of renewed interest in a wider circle of events that might count as special divine action beyond merely prodigious signs and wonders. The argument from predictive prophecy, for example, which Hume brushed aside as merely a special case of the miraculous, deserves and is beginning to receive consideration and analysis in its own right. What used to be called special providences, in which the extraordinary element lies not in any obvious violation of the causal closure of the physical world, but rather in the auspicious timing of apparently independent events, are now on the table for serious discussion. A common theme in all these developments is that they are intrinsically, intensely interdisciplinary. Each of the fields of study required to move the discussion forward: history, philosophy, mathematics, biblical criticism, comparative religion, cultural anthropology, cognitive science, and others, is deep and rich enough to absorb and to reward a lifetime's efforts, even for individuals of extraordinary talents. We should expect, therefore, that some of the most interesting advances will take place where there is significant collaborative work being done. With so much exciting and difficult work on the horizon, why would anyone pause to look backward? I suggested at the beginning that philosophy was roused out of its 20th century complacency on the issue of special divine action by two factors: advances in probabilistic modeling and the rediscovery of the fact that this issue has a history. That rediscovery can be well traced in 4 important books appearing over the course of 25 years. In his 1981 study of the deist controversy, the great debate on miracles from Joseph Glanville to David Hume, Robert Burns reveals the sources of many of Hume's objections, demonstrating that Hume was neither the first nor the last word on the subject of miracles, even within the 18th century. Burns' historical work undermines the illusion of Hume's originality on this topic. Joseph Houston's book, Reported Miracles, A Critique of Hume, has a more polemical tone, but it too takes a historical view of the subject, going back to Augustine and Aquinas and Locke, treating Hume, notwithstanding his prominent place in the title, as just one more voice in a larger conversation. Simply by doing this, Houston's work subverts the concept of Hume's centrality to the discussion. John Ehrman's book, Hume's Abject Failure, had, of course, its principal impact on the technical side, but what some reviewers seem to have lost sight of is that Ehrman devotes more than half of the book to reprinting older sources on the subject of miracles, and that he says quite explicitly that many of Hume's contemporaries on the Christian side of the debate demonstrated a better grasp of the subtleties of inductive reasoning than Hume himself had. In its own way, this frank admission that Hume's contemporaries actually had the better of the argument is as damaging as the formal critique of the argument itself. The second half of Ehrman's work undermines Hume's predominance over his contemporaries. Timothy Larson's brilliant historical study, Crisis of Doubt, is not a discussion of Hume at all, though Hume's name crops up about a dozen times in the text. Larson tells the story of 7 reconverts men who lost their faith and became active in the Victorian freethinking and secularist movement, but then reconsidered their doubts, returned to the faith of their youth, and devoted a substantial number of years to preaching, lecturing, or writing on behalf of their recovered faith. Hume was, in many cases, one of the causes of their loss of faith, but after their reconversions, several of them expressly and articulately repudiated Hume's arguments. Larson's book effectively dispels the myth of Hume's mastery over reflective intellects. That, in brief, is how we came to the state of the art in the philosophical discussion of special divine action. What comes next? This is the place where telling the story gets tricky, for, of course, I have no insight into the future, no exemption from the typical human failure to see beyond the present moment. To see beyond one's own blind spots, one needs a different pair of eyes. Eyes that are free from them, but where to find them? Here, I think C.S. Lewis offers an important clue. Every age, he writes, has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books. Of course, older authors have their own blind spots as well, and of course, we have, in some respects, moved on. We know things now that even the best scholars writing in the 18th and the 19th centuries did not know. But they also knew some things that we may have forgotten. If I may borrow or appropriate a phrase from T.S. Eliot, the communication of the dead is sometimes tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Time and again, I've approached the threshold of some long-abandoned controversy, expecting to see nothing but cold ashes in the grate, only to discover live coals still smoldering there, wanting only a breath of fresh air to burst into open flame. I have time for only a handful of illustrations. There are whole categories of argument currently employed in the investigation of historical claims, including claims of divine action, that cry out for both philosophical and historical analysis. Consider the argument from silence. Typically the argument that because some person or place or event is unmentioned in a particular historical text, or perhaps unmentioned in any text we now possess, that person or place never existed, or the event never transpired. It takes only passing familiarity with scholarship, both of the Old and of the New Testament, to reveal how pervasive this form of reasoning is. Shouldn't Paul have mentioned more details about Jesus' life if he actually knew them? Shouldn't the authors of the Synoptic Gospels have mentioned the resurrection of Lazarus if it really happened? Shouldn't Josephus have mentioned the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem? And for heaven's sake, why doesn't anyone besides Matthew say something about those resurrected saints walking around Jerusalem just after Jesus' resurrection, seen by many? What we need to inform our judgment about arguments from silence is both analytical and historical information. What is the proper way to reconstruct such arguments? And given the reconstruction, what sorts of information might help us to evaluate them? For the reconstruction, modern tools are needed. But buried in the annals of previous centuries of controversy, we can find a wealth of examples where the argument from silence fails, and fails spectacularly. The existence of the works of Thucydides, for example, is not noted by any author whose works we now possess until 250 years after they were written. Grafton's Chronicles, which embrace the reign of King John, make no mention of Magna Carta. In the extensive memoirs of Ulysses Grant, Lincoln's general during the American Civil War, there is no mention of the Emancipation Proclamation. Neither Herodotus nor Thucydides nor any of their contemporaries mentions Rome, a fact Josephus brings up in his controversy with Appian. In his sprawling travelogues, Marco Polo never refers to tea, or to printed books, or to the Great Wall of China. Think, Marco, did you see something 15 feet high, 20 feet wide, hundreds of miles long? He doesn't mention it. Examples of this sort could be multiplied almost endlessly. At what point is it unreasonable for us, in the face of an avalanche of such examples, to retain our initial confidence regarding what ancient authors would have said? Turning to methodology. Take the problem of criteria of historicity, currently a hotly contested issue. Among the criteria commonly employed by historians is the criterion of embarrassment. How shall we construe this criterion? How much weight will it bear? Contemporary scholars are not united in their approach, but many of them are unhappy with the present use of such criteria. If we are not too proud, we might travel back nearly 3 centuries to find insight from participants in the deist controversy who wrote about the same concept under a different terminology and gave serious thought to the methodological issues surrounding its use. Thus, the dissenting minister James Foster, after having canvassed several instances of what he calls the candor of the gospel authors, he acknowledges, this consideration is not in itself a guarantee of truth. And then he concludes, quote, "I shall lay no more stress upon it than it deserves, and consider it not as direct proof, but as a circumstance that looks well, and in conjunction with others must have its weight." Foster's modesty is becoming. But it should not lead us to overlook the deeper fact that he locates the appeal to this criterion within the framework of a cumulative case. A modern Bayesian will at once recognize how such a consideration might contribute to a likelihood ratio. A modern historian will see a field for the investigation of candor and its counterfeits in both genuine and spurious works. A vivid awareness of the manner in which diverse pieces of evidence may contribute to a case is a hallmark of some of the best works of the 18th and 19th centuries. Perhaps this is due to the interest taken in the subject by members, some of them eminent members, of the legal profession: Simon Greenleaf, Edmund Bennett, Benjamin Shaw, Walter Chandler, George Griffin, Charles Robert Morrison, Francis Jones Lamb, to name just a few of the older writers. Such authors have a good deal to say on the subject of weighing evidence. When we find Shaw, for example, speaking of the manner in which a number of distinct lines of proof converge in a common center, I suggest that we should sit up and take notice. Sometimes work done for one purpose may serve us well for another. Slightly different one. I mentioned the task of collecting and sifting through the documentation for modern miracle claims. Here, we may find guidance in the work of writers like John Douglas, who sought to lay out criteria for distinguishing genuine from spurious miracle reports. There are grounds for doubt, Douglas suggests, if the report is first issued long after the time of the purported event, or if it is made only at a great distance from the place where the event is said to have occurred, or if it is made in a context where, if it were false, it might suffer to pass unexamined. Douglas applies these criteria to the examples Hume advances in part 2 of his essay: the cures of Vespasian, the claimed miracle at Saragossa, the recoveries at the tomb of the Abbé Paris in France, and he finds these examples wanting. How might such an approach help us with the evaluation of modern-day miracle claims? Through neglect for generations, a vast library of work on this subject has been lost to our view. It is not wise, particularly for those who wish to advance the state of the art, to refuse to study the past. If we choose to neglect it, our condition will be even more pitiable and less excusable than that described by Alfred the Great in the preface to his translation to Gregory's Pastoral Care. Then, when I was mindful of all this, then I also remembered how I saw before that it was all laid waste and burned, how the churches stood throughout all England filled with treasures and books, and also a great multitude of God's servants, and they knew very little benefit of those books, because they might not understand them at all, for they were not written in their own language. Thus they might have spoken, our elders, when they formerly held these places. They loved wisdom, and through it they found wealth and left it to us. Here, A man may yet see their footprint, but we may not follow after them. And for this reason, we have now lost both the wealth and the wisdom, because we would not incline to the footprint with our mind. Thank you. Have we time for a brief question and answer? If there are any, we can do, just maybe a couple, if anyone's interested. Otherwise, we'll move right on. Yes?
So, the idea of setting out fairly precise criteria for distinguishing genuine and spurious or at least unverifiable miracle courses. The new Benedict XIV brings this up in the 18th century as the church is trying to discern miracles in the question.
Actually, it arises among Anglicans and dissenters as part of an attempt to address challenges from the Roman Catholic Church, because ecclesiastical history is, of course, replete with reported miracles. And so it becomes then part of a cottage industry to separate, forgive me, Andrew, the Protestant wheat from the papistical chaff. And so and some Catholic authors themselves will look at ecclesiastical history and say it is not obligatory to believe that the blood of St. Januarius is liquefied again and again, for example, or that the oil of St. Walburga will actually confer healing. But these criteria were deployed as part of an effort to address challenges like that put forward in the second part of Hume's essay, where he said, well, if you believe these things, you ought to believe those as well. After all, there's just as much or just as little evidence on all sides. And their response was, no, there's not. You're wrong. Here's why. Very explicitly. But note the way that Douglas puts it. He's quite careful. He says, there are reasons for doubt if any of these factors, great distance in time, great distance in space, a context in which it might suffer to pass unchallenged even if it were fraudulent. He does not say that means that the event didn't happen. It's an epistemic point, and that's all. And sometimes writers bring forward criteria, Charles Leslie in his Short and Easy Method with the Deists, and he applies them very dogmatically. Here are 4 positive criteria. If any event meets these, it did happen. You can be absolutely certain. A modern probabilistically trained mind cringes at anyone saying, yeah, just, these 4 things and then that's it. And it's all over. And yet the things he brings up are interesting. And they may serve for a reformulation, a thoughtful reformulation. Well, if these criteria were met, would they make the case stronger? Why? Can you show us how? And so even if we don't adopt directly the suggestions as they were intended, there are sometimes very interesting things waiting back there in the older literature that can be appropriated for our uses. Is that a fair answer to your question? Good. Anyone else? One more. Sure.
You described at the beginning that Hume was the only thing that was made on the issue, and that's because it's extraordinary how much was neglected. At Hume's time, as well as at other times, there is so much more work on the very same question. The debate in which Hume's argument took place would be worth reading. How did it happen that people thought that way, that Hume's text is the only thing that's to be read?
Right, so the question is, how did that dominance come about? And of course, I'm painting with a broad brush, and I should acknowledge that here and there, people were aware of more than Hume, but I'm talking about what made its way into sort of the canonical state of the discipline, what was published in the anthologies, right? It's mostly Hume. Read Antony Flou's article on miracles in Paul Edwards' Encyclopaedia of Philosophy, and it's all about Hume. It's the central focus of the discussion. So how did it get lost? And the interesting thing is that Hume's contemporaries did not think he had won. John Leland, in his view of the principal deistical writers, quite defiantly says, the adversaries of Christianity have appealed to the bar of reason, the advocates have followed them to that bar, and have shown that the evidences appeal to any fair and impartial reason. So, his contemporaries felt that they had quite well answered him, and indeed there is one report, I've been unable to verify it independently, that Hume said of George Campbell's response, the Scotch theologue has defeated me, which, if true, is quite remarkable, but not something one normally reads about in Hume scholarship. Through the early 19th century, Hume's argument was not one considered to be decisive, certainly not of paramount importance. In his 3 essays on religion, John Stuart Mill actually says, well, Hume was wrong. I'm still cynical, but not, Hume went too far. I think it's the late 19th century where it really begins to take over, and maybe that had something to do with English positivism, of course, before logical positivism, Comte's sort of positivism on the continent and in England. And that's a story waiting to be told in its own right, but it's all I can say is I'm glad that period is now past.